Okay, per usual, we're going to have to bounce back into history. I mentioned last time that when you're looking at this particular region, East Asia, that you have a very, very long, continuous history that's usually pretty complicated in terms of it's interrelated, but not clearly so. But nonetheless, there's a long continuity there. You don't have the equivalent to like dark ages or something like that, where basically everything sort of shuts off, then new versions show up. So there's two major historical issues that both shape the region and also probably equally importantly shape how they see the world outside and how the outside sees them. The first is the 19th century, and basically what happens in the 19th century, remember we're looking with India, is that in this part of the world, colonialism goes rampant. You get the British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, everyone and his brother trying to move into this area because there still is this sort of odd view that because, especially China, and again, I don't know if it's because of the size of China or the sort of mysterious Oriental aspect of China seen by Europeans. I don't know, I've never figured it out. But anyhow, in that context, what happens is that Europeans become convinced that China's like the great gold pile that you just sort of have to jump onto, and you're just gonna make more money than you know what to do with if you can get into it. And so what happens is in rather surreal ways, the Europeans just get hugely involved in China trade, trying to control parts of China, anything they can to make money off of China. Now, the most egregious of these are the Brits. And there's a bunch of reasons of which I've never bothered to actually study, but anyway, so the British decide that China's where it's at. Now, initially, the trade with China is fairly equitable in a sense that what you have is the British want Chinese goods and they pay China pretty much money. And I guess part of the reason there's such a complicated relationship is that China in the 15, 16, even 1700s, outside of military aspects, really was more technologically advanced than Europe. China had porcelain. They didn't have, what do we know, Chinaware. They didn't have that in Europe. That was a Chinese invention. Chinese, the idea of cheap paper, which, sort of existed in Europe, but not to the same extent. There was a lot of stuff that China had that was actually technologically superior. And so, the Europeans, especially in this case, the Brits, but also the Portuguese and other ones, they wanted this. And the problem was they didn't have anything technologically attractive to trade to the Chinese. You weren't going to trade glass beads or, various little knickknacks or something you'd find in an ABC store to the Chinese when their stuff was more advanced than yours was. They pretty much, the classic stereotype now, Chinese stuff being sort of not necessarily well made. That was the stereotype the Chinese had of the European stuff. And it was pretty accurate. So the problem the Europeans had is if they wanted to trade with the Chinese, they had to pay in cash. Whereas traditionally, if it was like, one of their colonial possessions like India or Pakistan, what's now Pakistan or something like that, they could basically at gunpoint demand stuff. So the China trade was hugely lucrative when you got the stuff back to Europe, but it was tremendously expensive for the countries in Europe. And especially because you have to remember, everyone existed on basically the gold standard at the time. So the more gold and silver is going to China, the less is in circulation in Europe. And so it starts to impact their economies. And they just basically don't want this. And the British were the most aggressive since by the early 19th century. They were, sort of on one hand, they were the big players in the world order globally. But also more importantly was the fact that, of course, Britain was the one that was so by then addicted to tea, among other things, but also silks, but especially tea. So the British, British East India Company, as I mentioned earlier, had the monopoly on tea. And by the early 19th century, they were really bugged by the fact that they had to pay the Chinese cash to get tea. They were already starting to grow it in India, but it wasn't considered equivalent to the Chinese good qualities of Chinese. So what the British East India Company comes up with, they kind of decide to come up with an alternative. And an alternative basically is to grow opium, which grows normally in Pakistan area. It's a poppy. That's basically the sap off of poppy. And they knew that was used in China for medicinal purposes. So they start growing opium for the idea of trading the opium, which of course they're basically getting for almost free since it's their plantations on their land in India, and selling, basically trading that to the Chinese for the tea. Well, what happens very quickly is the Chinese go, well, this ain't happening, very simply because what happens is opium, one, is highly addictive, And the Chinese didn't have need of this, coming, these huge amounts coming in. So they basically said no. And the British East India / the British government, since they were pretty much one and the same thing, basically says, well, you don't have that option. Then you end up with what are the first and second opium wars, where basically the British at gunpoint forced the Chinese to accept opium and trade for whatever the British want to trade him for. So you end up in this weird situation that the world's first global, super company basically becomes the leader in the drug trade, and you end up with the British government, since they support and actually back this. The British government basically becomes the world's first drug dealers. And so your first global drug cartel is ironically the BEIC based in London and the British government based in London. And the first druggies, in the sense of, classic, stereotyped addicted population, are the Chinese. And every time the Chinese try to fight it, the British have another war with them and basically force the Chinese to allow them to sell as much opium as they want. Now, it becomes very complicated because one of the sort of nasty side effects of this is that British missionaries and other forces in China get involved in the opium trade, either to sell it so they can finance their operations, or, basically for a set of reasons I've never bothered to examine. So to the Chinese, they see anything British, and to a certain extent Europeans, but especially the Brits, as tied to the opium trade. By the late 19th century, a huge proportion of the Chinese population is addicted to opium, which is all grown in India and all controlled by the British government. Since after 1857, India belongs to the government. So the British government were the first great drug dealers. And of course, at that period of time, they're also the world's global military. It's a really, really weird situation. For the Chinese, it just reinforced their attitude that nothing from the outside was of any benefit to China. There was nothing in the drug trade that did anything good for China. Opium did absolutely nothing good for China. The European trade in general, the Germans take, a couple of ports, and that's the only thing they teach the opium. The Chinese how to do is how to make beer. And so, there was nothing that the Europeans had to offer that benefited the Chinese, but everyone wanted a piece of China. And so the end result is China just gets picked apart like a huli chicken. Large part of the country remains, independent technically, but every European power is fighting for pieces of China. In fact, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905 was between the Russians and the Japanese, but ironically, it was over parts of China that were both competing for control of. So China just gets basically pulled apart. No one has any concern about the Chinese. In the United States and in Europe, there was a huge anti-Chinese movement in terms of limiting immigration of Chinese and actually trying to throw Chinese out. We saw a little bit of that here, though it wasn't as bad as the mainland. And so what you get is the Chinese are just, incredibly cynically bothered legitimately by the fact that on the whole, the whole world doesn't want to have anything to do with Chinese as people, but they're sure as hell willing to make money off of Chinese. And there's absolutely no moral social compunction by Europeans and or Americans in selling drugs and other stuff to the Chinese. You shouldn't be doing this. That doesn't even seem to happen. And so this just reinforces a typical China or traditional Chinese attitude that the outside world is nothing but bad news. And you can never trust outsiders. They might tell you one thing, but sooner or later, when it finally comes down to the realities of the situation is what's in it for them. And they'll basically lie through their teeth to get whatever they want out of you, but there's nothing in it for you. This is actually behind Chinese policies in 2022. Xi Jinping and his version of the Chinese political system, his version of the PRC, is totally based on the assumption that no one outside of China has China's best interest at heart. Even if they say they want to help the Chinese, it's all because they're going to get something out of it, and they're very likely going to screw the Chinese over in the process. And this shapes Chinese foreign policy. Now, in a very cynical way, it also means that Xi Jinping can basically say whatever he wants to about the outside world, and everyone who's in a large part of the Chinese population is going to believe him, because their history says that the outside world hasn't done anything for them. And there's nothing more egregious than the British drug trade in China. I mean, that was obscene even when it happened. By the 1870s, 1880s, opium consumption was illegal in most of Europe, but they were still making billions of dollars selling it to the Chinese because it's just the Chinese. So, there's some really grim realities about European and Asian relationships. Now, Japan jumps into this because Japan basically gets its independence broken. Japan is sort of, doing its own thing, sort of closing itself off to the outside world through the 1700s. In the 1840s, due to a bunch of technical stuff we don't have time to get into, the Americans decide that they've had enough of this. And so the Americans send in a military squadron and basically, show the Japanese that if they don't let the Americans in, the Americans are going to blow the crap out of Tokyo. And so in 1845, 1846, 47, the Japanese agree to allow foreigners into Japan and to sort of accept, being part of the world society, though they do it only literally at gunpoint. So when the Japanese start to realize what's going on in the world around them, they're looking at China, of course, right across the China Sea. And they're seeing a place that's already awash in opium, it's awash in British, French, German, everyone in a feeding frenzy, and just taking China to part. The Japanese are like, holy crap, we don't want that. So the Japanese basically decide by the 1860s, 1870s that they're going to make themselves into a regional power that will be powerful enough that no one will give them any crap. And so what they do is they decide that there's two ways to do this. One is they send folks off to Europe to basically copy the best of different things. So they buy, battleships from the British, they get their troops trained by the Germans. They basically do everything they can to catch up, and they do an amazing job. In 1860, Japan was still basically a samurai society that had been in place for almost 1,000 years. By 1880, only 20 years later, they were a full-on modern, 19th century society. They made this jump in 20 years. They basically moved about maybe 200 years a year. So the end result of all this was by the 1880s, 1890s, Japan's decided, okay, no one's going to mess with us. What they decided then was that the way to be respected and to be in charge was to copy the Europeans. And of course, the Europeans they saw were the colonial Europeans that were taking China apart. So what Japan decides is if you're going to survive in the 19th, 20th century, you have to be a colonial power like the British, the French, and everyone else. So they basically mimic what they see around them, and they come up and they start a Japanese empire. And they have two wars with the Chinese, beat the hell out of them, take parts of China, have to cough them up, have a war with Russia, beat the Jesus out of the Russians, and traumatic change in world politics from 1904, 1905. And all of a sudden, the little Asian country beats the third largest military in the world. Huge sort of, repercussions for the next, well, right down till today. They have to give most of that property back, which ironically, again, is in China. And then World War I, the Japanese basically backed the British and jump into the war in 1914, 3 years before the Americans joined World War I. And so what you have is by the early 20th century, Japan has made itself not only into a mimic of the Europeans, but they're actually in many cases more powerful than the Europeans. It's arguable by 1918-19, at the end of World War I, that Japan had by far the best Navy in the world, certainly in terms of quality, and one of the most powerful navies in the world. And its army was undoubtedly one of the most powerful. So they moved from absolutely nowhere, sort of guys dressed in samurai outfits, walking around with swords, to everything from battleships to airplanes to early tanks, in the space of like 60 years. And no one outside of Japan was really willing to cut them any credit for this. Well, the Japanese get really irritated with all this because one, they just see, as I mentioned when I said about geosociobiology, Japanese just see themselves as being innately different. They like to say it doesn't mean better, but the reality is like the Germans, Japanese geosociobiology usually sort of translate as better. And so the end result is they decide to expand their colonial empire. When at the end of World War I, everyone sort of says, no, you gotta cool this. You can't go on taking stuff all the time. And the Japanese are like, well, the British have stuff, the French have stuff, the Americans have stuff. The Americans have the Philippines by then and Guam. So it's like, who used to tell us? And so basically by the 1920s, 1930s, Japan becomes one of the big global powers. And in this process, they have acquired a bunch of territory. They've acquired parts of China in the 1930s. 1911, they acquire Korea. In 1914, they acquire all the German colonies, which is most of Micronesia. And so, they basically have made themselves into a major colonial power. Having said that, the geosociobiology part never gets discussed. So in this, when Japan takes over Korea, when they take over Okinawa, for example, when they take over the Micronesian region, they don't see these people as members of the Japanese Empire. They see them as subject races of the Japanese Empire. And when Japan eventually, in the late 1930s, takes over, a huge chunk of the rest of China, they just massacre millions of people, and get engaged in all sorts of surrealistic concentration camp massacres and such like that that even make the Nazis look pretty low key. And the end result of all this is that because of the Japanese rhetoric and the way the Japanese very brutally treat the rest of the Asians, is at the end of World War II when Japan loses and they're put back on the Japanese islands only, is everyone in Asia just hates them with a passion. And again, they're just reflecting how the Japanese had treated them over the last, say, 50 years. And so what you get is, at the end of World War II, a very strange phenomenon happens. Germany at the end of World War II is made to apologize for its actions in World War II. And so you have the war crime trials, and you have, the German Constitution basically says that Germany has to provide, access to immigrants and refugees, and they have to pay X amount of money in reparations to groups they, tried to wipe out. Well, Japan, because of the post-World War II phenomena, never gets any of that. Japan, even today, has never apologized for any of its behavior in World War II. In fact, if you go to Japanese textbooks, World War II is considered a mistake. Pearl Harbor, the massacre of all the Chinese in the 1930s, that's all just sort of a mistake and a misunderstanding. And so the Japanese government, the past Japanese governments, the current Japanese governments have never apologized for their behavior in the 19th and 20th centuries. And not surprisingly, if you're the Chinese and the Koreans and other groups, you're really pissed off about that, because here's a group that basically just reamed you, made, literally millions of people slaves, for example, in China, hundreds of thousands of slaves in Korea. In fact, there's a large Korean population in Japan. Folks, even now, that are now third, fourth, fifth generation Koreans that were forcibly brought from Korea as slave labor, left in Japan at the end of World War II. They couldn't get back to Korea, and so they stayed in Japan. They're still considered foreign aliens. Well, they still have different passports than the Japanese and their different code cards, very much like the Turks in Germany. It's exactly the same thing. And so what you get is, in this entire phenomena, Japan has never had to acknowledge its role in the world in the, basically 1880 to 1945. And so no one trusts them. The Koreans, the Chinese, no one trusts the Japanese enough for them to throw them, because they're firmly convinced that the reason they didn't apologize is because they still have the same attitudes. In other words, as far as they're concerned, nothing's changed. Japan might look different, it might talk different, but it's actually not thinking any differently. And so what you get is this very, very complex scenario where Japan is now, again, one of the major global powers. But in Asia, on one hand, people are deathly afraid of China and the way it's growing militarily and stuff like that, and very aggressive. But they're also equally afraid of the Japanese, because they have historical reasons to be afraid of both of them. But most recently, they have a lot of reasons to be afraid of the Japanese. The United States doesn't seem to pick up on any of this. But then again, I hate to say it, the United States government oftentimes is just about as ethnocentric as the American population. But it's one of the reasons that everything is so complex in Asia. Everyone remembers their history. In many cases, their history was, their grandparents' time. It wasn't like a million years ago. And it's very much a part of the world they live in. And so almost none of these, unlike Europe, we can argue some of these have been sort of resolved. And in Asia, none of these have been resolved. And so the end result is you have a huge amount of distrust, suspicion, and, what is it you actually mean versus what you say. I'm sort of playing the card.